All right. Let me pull up Rumble.
May need to tweak President. If he was having some sound issues, like there's a co-host with a request for a mic.
Okay. So just to reiterate for everybody that may be new here. Let me remove her and then I'll bring her back up as a co-host.
Right.
Okay. I did that. All right. If you guys all could share out the space, please. And I'm going to do that as well. And then Bridget and Cousin It can repost any of your post, like a quote post, to get more people in here. If you guys wouldn't mind doing that. Okay, so basically, we're going to do a little something different today. And it's Operation Gladio. And if you guys wouldn't mind looking over on Rumble and see if I come across over there, and just let me know when it does. We have been looking at some parallels here because remember, we always talk about patterns, and it has been brought to our attention through several videos that there's a lot of parallels between what we're living today and 1968 election, to include the fact that the election in 1968 occurred on November 5th, just like our election.
Rumble appears to be up and running great.
Okay, thank you. Just like our election is going to happen this year on November 5th. And we think all of those little coincidences are very interesting. So I want to set the stage for what was going on. And I want to talk to you guys about some of the Operation Gladio events that happened in 1967 and 1968 that at the time we had no idea they were actually Gladio events. And actually, probably up until about a month ago, I would not have even thought about it in the way I do now. But understanding how our government has organized, created these groups of people like the Cuban exiles, when in fact they were Gladio operators, and then labeled them as Cuban exiles, and they used them all around the world to do Operation Gladio events, kind of has us now all thinking on a different track and going back and looking at all of the different groups. Well, about a month ago, I was doing some reading in another book. As a matter of fact, it was while I was reading the WWF Panda Leaks book and how they used some of the different organizations to create riots. And Bridget and Cousin It and I were talking one day, and I'm like, do you guys think maybe the Weather Underground was an Operation Gladio as well? Because if you begin looking at the way in which it was used in the bombings, and it mirrors almost exactly what they were doing to the Red Brigade via the Red Brigade around the same time frame in Italy, and also in Germany and in England with the IRA. There was so many parallels that it became one of those, well, duh moments. once we started talking through it. So we started looking into, and this is at the very beginning, so this is probably going to take a couple of days worth. I spent all morning, like the last 6 hours, going through news reporting of 1967 and 1968. I haven't even kind of broke into the written part of the newspaper element, but this is just old, Walter Cronkite footage and that type of thing. So let me tell you what we found out. In 1967, the year before, so that fall would be when people are seriously starting to line up presidential campaigns for the 1968 season. The most prominent thing going on in 1967 was the anti-war movement. And there, again, this is, if you watch the videos, these are not hippies. These are well-dressed people, and generally on college campuses, which we know is where they love to do Operation Gladio activity. And they are genuinely opposed to the war. And they're having a lot of effect on the Johnson presidency. They're very articulate. If you listen to some of the news casters interviewing them, and it was making a huge difference in the feelings of the people. So almost within a few months of this increased focus on these college campus interviews, you have what would appear to be agitators starting to be injected into their movement. And you start hearing some really crazy rhetoric. Still generally peaceful, but they're getting more and more visible. And President Johnson, the more visible they got, the more, and a lot of this has been declassified since, Johnson and the Attorney General starts telling the FBI that they need to be more involved. Well, we know their involvement is in an agitation format, and that, as we see now, oftentimes they are part of the infiltration and agitation part of it. So these massive marches of college professors, teachers, housewives, police, everyday people are involved in this anti-war effort. And it's happening all over the world. It was happening in Rome. It was happening in Germany. And so, you can collectively see the international syndicate starting to ship bricks at this point. Because you have to keep in mind what is at stake here. They're not over there trying to free people from communism. They're over there establishing and magnifying their drug trade throughout all of Southeast Asia. And there's billions and billions of dollars at stake. So that sets the context with an Operation Gladio overlay to 1967. And when you go back and you look at 1968, a lot of the commentary dubbed that year of tragedy. And I was unaware of all of the different people that was involved in the 1968 race. There was people I had no idea was involved in that race. For example, LBJ, Senator McCarthy, RFK on the Democrat side. On the Republican side, you had Romney's dad, Nelson Rockefeller, and Reagan, who at some point during the 1968 season had either officially declared they were running or had exploratory kind of irons in the fire at some point. So, and that's not all of them. There's even more. But those are kind of the, Hubert Humphrey was in it. There's a lot of people, and we're going to go through them, McGovern, all of them. And you're going to begin to see the parallels with what's going on right now. Unfortunately, 1968 was labeled the year of tragedy because there was a lot of tragedy involved in it. And I think that's why people are telling us, people that we respect, like General Flynn and Robert Barnes and people like that, are telling us to pay attention, keep your head on a swivel, and understand we're not in uncharted territory. These people use a playbook. So let's kind of dive into what that playbook looked like in 1968. On the Democrat side, initially, and let me get you some dates here. I did a brief timeline. So in November of 1967, McCarthy announces that he's running against LBJ. Now, keep in mind, LBJ is the sitting president. So that's not unlike what RFK Jr. did to Biden, right? He announced he's running against him. And LBJ, in some cases, like in New Hampshire, wasn't even on the ballot. He won New Hampshire as a write-in over McCarthy, but not by a lot. And so, again, you see the parallels where we're being told that people can't be on the ballot. It really doesn't matter. 1968 proved that. So this is November 1967. January 30th, the Tet Offensive starts in Vietnam. And probably tomorrow, I'm going to explain more of the Vietnam angle to this whole thing. We'll get into Vietnam when we do the Asian thing, but it is relevant to this. So we'll do kind of a sketch of what was going on and what the Tet Offensive entailed. But that's 30 January. And the next, 2 days later, Nixon announces that he's going to jump in the race. The next day, the Saigon police chief is on the page of a newspaper shooting him in the head, a Viet Cong supposedly infiltrator, which isn't exactly what happened at all. And the police chief was basically on the dole of the CIA. So you can kind of see, we start the Tet Offensive, Nixon announces, and then right away we've got something to do with the Vietnam exploding, making LBJ look bad. So that's kind of like 1 week all in a row. And a week later, you have Wallace, who announces that he also is going to be running. And Wallace announces that he's doing it as a third party, kind of like RFK ends up as a third party. And on March the 12th is when LBJ wins the narrow victory in New Hampshire against McCarthy. And that's kind of his holy shit moment. That McCarthy has way more traction. Wallace being in the game changes it as well, because he's going to draw Southern Democrats away from LBJ, and things are kind of getting like the writing on the wall type of scenario. And once Robert Kennedy sees the blood in the water as a result of New Hampshire, he announces 4 days later. So on March 16th, he announces he's running. Rockefeller, a few days later, who's running on the Republican side, drops out. And within 10 days of Rockefeller dropping out, LBJ is out. So on March 31st, he drops out, not unlike Biden just did. Keep in mind, he's the incumbent president. And on March 31st, he decides he's not running for re-election. So, less than a week later, Martin Luther King is killed. Now, you have to understand that in 1968, race was a big deal. And the Martin Luther King aftermath would look like what we went through in 2020, as far as the summer of 2020 after George Floyd. It was every large city on fire, riots everywhere. And in the aftermath, you begin to see, and this is years later, you begin to see that there was an underlying agitation going on, like some invisible hand, as all of these otherwise very peaceful MLK adherents to his entire message, who had preached for years the exact opposite of that. And so again, you have an underlying entity, I'm just going to leave it at that appears to be formulating a strategy of tension inside the United States, moving us all towards the candidates that, in my opinion, they've probably already chosen at this point. And I'm going to tell you why I think that in a little bit. Then you have, okay, so that's April 4th, MLK is killed. At the end of April, Humphrey enters the race. And obviously, Humphrey is LBJ's vice president. Well, why would he wait a month? If LBJ drops out, why wouldn't he just immediately announce? And once Humphrey announces, Rockefeller decides he's getting back in the race at the end of April. That's very, very late. So why did he do that? So Rockefeller gets back in on the Republican side. And it's basically Nixon's game to lose at this point, based on the other people. Now he's a wobbler, changed his mind. So Rockefeller's basically discredited himself. The rest of them weren't polling very well. So Nixon basically has the ground game because of something that I was unaware of. Now, keep in mind, we all know that Nixon spent 8 years as Eisenhower's vice president. And during those 8 years, Operation Gladio was set up and fielded and funded. So there's lots of interaction between Nixon and Operation Gladio. Now, Nixon kind of steps aside once he loses against JFK. And during the interim 1966 midterm elections, Nixon is everywhere. He's helping people win. He's showing up on the stump. And Republicans do fairly well. So that kind of is his springboard into the 1968 race, because he takes those quote unquote wins into his announcing that he's going to be running for president. So we're at the end of April. Humphrey's in. We've got Wallace in. We've got RFK in. On the Democrat side, McCarthy's in and doing very well. And basically, Humphrey gets no traction at all. Wallace has very little traction except for in the Southeast. So this is a two-man race, and it's McCarthy against RFK. And they're dueling it out in state after state after state. Well, RFK starts winning several of the primaries. Going into the Oregon primary, very contentious. And McCarthy manages to upset RFK and wins the Oregon. So now California becomes a do or die primary. And again, it's neck and neck with McCarthy and RFK, not the other two. They're not even in the race. I mean, technically they're in the race, but they get, no one votes for them. As a matter of fact, I have the statistics here. I'm looking at my timeline and not my narrative. I'll get back to the narrative in a minute, but the race that was in California was like 49-43. So the other ones got like 2% combined. That's how competitive this race was between RFK and McCarthy. Well, June 4th, June 4th that year is the California primary, and RFK wins. And it is that evening that RFK is assassinated. So we've got now two major pillars of the Democrat Party who's had assassination attempts, and successful ones, ran against them. This is all so that the international syndicate can control who becomes the president in the 1968 election. And the reason why I thought this was so relevant is because they didn't stop at one. We're now up to two. And that's not even mentioning some of the campaign people that I ran across that weirdly, like a Dave Sterling in New Hampshire ends up dead in a car wreck that was kind of weird circumstances. So again, there's definitely an invisible hand operating in all of this. So on August 8th, Nixon becomes the nominee for the Republican Party. The Democrat convention is August 29th. It happens to be in Chicago, just like the one this year. And given what I just told you, that the other two people are in less than 5%, you would find it completely strange that Humphrey ends up as the Democrat nominee. Not unlike what's going to happen here, where there's going to be someone who was not even in the race going to end up as the Democrat nominee. So at this point, in just looking at the parallels, I was totally freaked out. So I found a video series that CNN had done several years ago that had incrementally broken down different snippets, and it was interviewing Pat Robertson. Now, I don't know if you guys know who Pat Robertson is, but I'm definitely telling you he was part of the international syndicate. And the people that he worked with on the Nixon campaign, because he was definitely part of the Nixon campaign. And I'm going to go over each one of those real quick. So Pat Robinson is kind of the religious gatekeeper for the Republican Party, like we have several now that we won't mention. And he brought in the evangelical side of the Republican Party. And there's, in case you guys don't know that, there are gatekeepers in each segment. Okay, so he's definitely a gatekeeper. And when you start looking back through much of his life, it's weird that he was raised as a Democrat. Not that that's all that unheard of, but he did spend a lot of time as a Democrat. He also spent time in, let's see. Let's see. Oh, yeah. So he was in the tail end of World War II and went into the Korean War, which is very interesting. And you'll understand why when we get to that. Oh, yeah. And he went to Yale Law School too. And the buddies that he hung around with after Yale, let's see, Yale was Ray Price and Richard Whalen. And I'm going to get to them in just a minute. Ray Price, I confirmed, was in the Skull and Bones at Yale. So those were his buddies there. He was also ordained into a Freemason church. Didn't even know there was such a thing. And that kind of gave him the beginnings. But listen to this. Robertson's Operation Blessing organization sent medical teams to developing countries to help people who had no access to medical care. In 1994, in the aftermath of the Rwanda genocide, Robinson solicited donations for medical supplies to refugees in neighboring Zaire, the Congo, where Robinson also had exploratory diamond mining operations. Now, don't you find that very interesting, knowing what we know about the Congo and what they did to those people over there? So Robinson, the guy who's pretending to be the religious gatekeeper, is basically a slave miner of diamonds in the Congo. And it says 2 pilots who were supposedly be taking medical supplies over to Zaire said that they were actually delivering diamond mining equipment over there. Isn't that weird? I think that's very weird. So as we have found out with all of the other people in our Operation Gladio series, no one is what they say they are. Robinson also, of course, is a media like mega guy with all of his different media ventures. So that makes him another controller of the narrative. And also, there was one more thing here. Oh, yeah. According to the Virginia Pilot newspaper, Robinson had dealings in Liberia with President Charles Taylor which is another one of those suspect people. And he negotiated a multi-million-dollar contract for gold mining in Liberia. Robinson denied having business dealings with Taylor. He also denied speaking to President Bush about these business dealings. And Taylor later testified at The Hague during his war crimes trial that he did in fact have business dealings with Robertson. Sorry. And I also think it's really weird that Robertson was very big into horse racing, which we all know to be a favorite activity of mobsters and people associated with the CIA on a regular basis. So that's just kind of generically. I mean, there's a lot more to Robertson, but we're just going to leave it there because I do want to get to Ray Price. We need to look at him. Very interesting guy. And I'm just going to go over a couple of his, what we would now refer to as bona fides. He was a Reagan speechwriter, as was Pat. Excuse me. And he also was suspected as being the deep throat guy. And if we look at his career, you have to look at a couple of things. He was at Life magazine, which we know was a CIA tool. He also was at the American Institute or Enterprise Institute, which was a CIA front. And this, let's see, Overseas Press Club of America, very much associated with the CIA because they use that to kind of dip their CIA agents into the quote unquote reporter model and then deployed them as CIA agents pretending to be press. So that's him. And then we're going to quickly go over Richard Whalen. He's come up in several of our Operation Gladio people, if you will. And let's see. If you look at his obituary in the Wall Street Journal, it does tell us quite a bit about him. And he wrote a very interesting book. I have the book, I've never read it, about, he basically kind of did a biography of Joseph P. Kennedy, which I find very interesting since he primarily worked for Republicans, although he does have some dealings with Democrats as well. But Mr. Whalen moved from New York to Washington to join the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which again is another CIA cutout. He has a position in politics that led him to be advisors to Nixon, Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. Nixon used Whalen for writing his positions on foreign policy. And let's see. I think there was one. Oh, yes, right here. He was a good buddy of William F. Buckley, who also was a known CIA agent. So he has a very interesting background. This Washington Post article goes into it as far as where he came from and, you know, basically some other attributes. So these are the people that are surrounding Nixon as he's running in 1968 for the office of president, which of course we know he wins. And just so that you also know, he won. His electoral count was 301 to 191. So fairly impressive victory. The actual popular vote, which we know does not matter, but it is an interesting indicator, was less than 1 million. It was right at 500,000 votes that separated Humphrey from Nixon. And of course, Humphrey tried to distance himself from LBJ's war record, which really ended up being worn as a weight around his neck the entire time, because of course the only time he spoke up as being against it was after he began running, and not during the actual presidency. So another tidbit that I thought was very interesting that happened in 1968, Nixon's daughter marries David Eisenhower, who is General Dwight D. President